Good afternoon and welcome to Out of the Archives, bringing the past into the future. We are so happy you are joining us today. In honor of Archives Month, which is the month of October, the Samuel C. Williams Library and the College of Arts and Letters are collaborating to bring some of our favorite items from the archives to you virtually, exemplifying the important relationship between archivists and historians. Today, you will hear from Dr. Lindsey Swindall, historian and teaching assistant professor, Leah Loscutoff, head of archives and special collections, and Ted Houghtaling, archivist and digital projects librarian, in an engaging virtual show and tell of historical items from the archives. A question and answer session will take place at the end of the lecture. Attendees may use the chat button at the bottom to submit questions. Questions will be collected and posed to our speakers at the end of the lecture. A recording of this webinar will be made available through the library's digital collections portal. With that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Lindsey Swindall, Leah Loscutoff, and Ted Houghtaling. Thank you.
All right. Hello and welcome to the first of what we hope will become a series of lectures with further collaboration with the College of Arts and Letters. So as Linda mentioned, October is Archives Month, which is an opportunity to bring more awareness to the value of archives and the work that archivists do, and also the work of historians that is supported by using archives. The archives is a place where people go to find information, but unlike a library collection of secondary resources, such as published scholarly books and journal articles, an archives contains unique documentation of firsthand accounts. Facts and data in the form of primary sources, which includes letters of correspondence, reports, photographs, research notes, diaries, and audio and video recordings. Throughout our daily lives, we create and keep information about our activities, our work, and our life. And archivists are responsible for collecting and organizing this information. And an archive serves to strengthen the collective memory by creating a reliable repository that provides irreplaceable documents, ensuring that future generations will be able to research and learn from our past. Next slide. So in the archives and special collections here at Stevens, we actively collect, preserve, and make available primary source materials that document the history of Stevens, the Stevens family of Hoboken, and the history of science and technology as it relates to Stevens alumni and faculty. The university archives includes departmental records, oral histories, faculty papers, alumni collections, ephemera, university publications, and other primary sources documenting the history of the university, including student and campus life. The special collections consist of manuscript collections, rare books, historic artifacts, and paintings. Next slide. All right, next slide. So I have a lot of favorite items in the archives here at Stevens. So it can be hard to focus on one collection to share. But the favorite that I often go back to is the presidential collection of Stevens' first president, Dr. Henry Morton. To tell this story is to also talk about the concept of developing an archives crush, which is something that can occur when you are going through an archival collection and discover many exciting and unexpected pieces to the story of a historic figure. In the case of Dr. Henry Morton, when I first had a chance to go through his presidential papers in the archives, I was expecting to find the usual run-of-the-mill types of materials like letters of correspondence, inaugural materials, speech transcriptions, scholarly articles written by him, and photographs. I did in fact find all those things, but also so much more. For example, in looking through his papers, I came across an illustrated translation of the Rosetta Stone, which is an ancient decree engraved on granite from Egypt in 196 BCE. With further research into the collection, I was able to learn that while studying at the University of Pennsylvania, Morton studied hieroglyphic languages and devoted his final 2 years in college to complete a full English translation of the Rosetta Stone. The illuminated pages from the translation were created by Morton himself, who was a pretty fantastic artist in his own right. Morton has been described as a genius endowed with balance of character, and his papers can validate this description of him. He was a well-balanced scholar who had many interests in art, literature. He wrote poetry and created original artwork. He also sponsored archaeological digs and had a deep interest in history and ancient civilizations. I am going to quickly remove my background because I have some of his collection here behind me. That is actually a full-size reproduction of Dr. Morton. We used it for the Founders Day soiree celebration that we had back in February. So he's looking over us right now. So in the presidential collection of Dr. Henry Morton, as I mentioned, we have original artwork. So I have a few pieces here. Let's see if I can show a little bit on the screen. We have this original illuminated page. It was a front page of the Rosetta Stone translation. And then we also have, Babylonian cuneiform from around 2000 BCE. We do have digital images of this where you can get a closer look. Dr. Morton sponsored archaeological digs, and this Babylonian cuneiform that we actually have in the archives was brought back by the second president, Alexander C. Humphreys, in 1902, the same year that Dr. Morton passed away, so it was dedicated in his memory. And then another little, we have a book of just his illustrations, doodles that he drew during his career, original paintings. Again, he wrote poetry. So he was a very well-balanced scholar, as you can tell. And then to continue on, Dr. Morton was also good friends with Andrew Carnegie. As you can see, there is a letter from Andrew Carnegie. It's actually to Alexander C. Humphreys. Andrew Carnegie was a Board of Trustee member at Stevens from 1891 until 1919 when he passed away. And there's a little bit of a story that's documented in Dr. Morton's unpublished work of poetry. And in the story, he talks about having lunch with Mr. and Mrs. Carnegie. And Mrs. Carnegie asked Dr. Morton what he was reading currently. And Dr. Morton replies, see, let me get the exact title, actually. Have it here. So Morton was having lunch with Mr. and Mrs. Carnegie, and Mrs. Carnegie asked Dr. Morton what book he was currently reading, and Dr. Morton replied with Kitchener to Khartoum, to which Mr. Carnegie said, "Oh, Dr. Morton, I never let my wife read any books of that kind." He continued to say, "Remember what St. Paul said, the husband shall be the ruler of the house." Dr. Morton then quickly replied, "Remember what the poet said, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." So Dr. Morton actually published a book of poetry by that very same title, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle rules the world, and he dedicated that pamphlet of poetry to Mrs. Carnegie. So hence, these are some of the great discoveries you can explore in archives and come across. And hence, this is part of the reason why Dr. Morton is still my #1 archives crush. So next slide.
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Ted Houghtaling. I'm the Archivist and Digital Projects Librarian here at the library. And a very happy Archives Month to you all. So today, I picked some items from the Stevens faculty collection, which includes materials going back as far as the first faculty here in the 1870s, up to some recently retired members. So it's a pretty comprehensive collection. There's correspondence, there's photographs, research reports, curricula, personal papers, and a whole variety of other documents. And the collection itself is about 22 linear feet, but there's a whole lot more in our backlog of unprocessed materials. So it's actually a great deal larger. And that's one of the many things that we do as archivists, is to chip away at that backlog. We determine the history of the records. We rehouse them to ensure that they're safely preserved, so that they can eventually be accessible to researchers like yourselves. And coming up for what I wanted to talk about, I found it was pretty hard to pick just one item. So I chose a little sub-collection as, that's part of the larger faculty collection that's related to a former faculty member here who I find very, very fascinating. And that's Harold Burris-Meyer, who worked at Stevens from about the late 1920s to about the 1950s. And he had two roles here at Stevens. He was the director of the Dramatic Society, and he, at the same time, he led a now defunct program here called the Sound Research Lab, which was part of the physics department and was partially funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And what I find so fascinating about Burris-Meyer's research is that he was experimenting with the use of light and sound as a way to induce a wide range of physical and emotional responses in the audience. And initially, this was applied to the theater with a number of Dramatic Society productions and other shows he consulted for on Broadway that demonstrated these techniques. So we see a whole range of experiments documented in this collection, where Burris-Meyer and his team of researchers, they not only analyzed and measured the influence of light and sound on human behavior, but more importantly, they figured out how to use that knowledge to manipulate human behavior. So he's essentially working in the field of psychoacoustics, which, we're talking 1920s, 1930s was starting to gain prominence in a number of different fields, as I'll briefly talk about. And throughout his career, Burris-Meyer didn't just limit this application to film and theater. During World War II, his research at Stevens caught the attention of the National Defense Research Committee. And so Burris-Meyer was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the Navy, where he conducted top secret research into the use of sound as a weapon of war. And later, after the war, his research was also applied to industry. Burris-Meyer was the consultant for, and later was the vice president of the Muzak Corporation, whose aim was to use sound as a way to increase worker productivity, which I'll show brief examples. So let's take a look at a few things. Okay. So in 1934, Burris-Meyer and the Dramatic Society produced a show called The Sound Show, which acted as a demonstration of a new prototype surround sound system, which later became the Stevens sound control system. And this device could produce a stereophonic mix of different audio sources, which were then broadcast through speakers that were placed throughout the theater space, the auditorium. So at one point during the play, the system was used to mimic the sound of galloping horses. So the audio would travel around the perimeter of the room, giving the illusion that there were actual forces inside the theater. And they also did that scene from Hamlet where Hamlet's father, represented as like a translucent phantom, was projected on stage and given a voice that followed its movement throughout the room, which was so remarkable for the time that newspapers around the Northeast published accounts of people's reactions to this demonstration as seen from this cartoon from the New York Ledger. So we have a lot of this stuff related to Burris-Meyer represented right here in the collection. So here's one box from the collection. And by the way, I don't know if any of you have actually been to an archives, but here is generally how materials are preserved and arranged. And this is how they would be given to you if you actually like attended a reading room in an archives. So there's a whole folder of like press clippings here. And there's programs, photographs, and scripts. I'll just briefly show you a few things related to this particular show. So see here, there's the program. Some photographs. There's the photo of Burris-Meyer. And here's what that sound control system would have been like, or how it would have seemed. And it was operated by students. Students were used as research assistants. So like, Burris-Meyer was conducting this research, but like students played a pretty active role in kind of, like applying this to like real world scenarios. And, remember, this is before Disney's Fantasia, which, demonstrated surround sound in movie theaters a few years later in 1940. So this was pretty radical stuff for 1934. And we're pretty fortunate to have this collection here in the archives. And the reason we do is that his widow, Anita Burris-Meyer, donated this collection to us in 1999. So that's one way that we build a collection. We work with donors. We do outreach to people who have materials we don't have, because there's a lot of gaps in any university's history that are not covered in the archives. So we rely on and work with current students, faculty, staff, alumni, and other donors who can help fill in those gaps. So we're pretty fortunate that Anita gave Stevens these materials, because it's a pretty fascinating collection. And I'm not even going to get into this research during World War II, as interesting as it is. Like, that's a whole another lecture. That's totally for another time. But remember, this collection is open to research. So, although you can't come to the archives in person this semester, get in touch with either me or Leah. We'll be more than happy to make some scans for you from this collection if you're interested in learning more. And lastly, I'll just quickly touch on some materials we have of Burris-Meyer's involvement with the Muzak Corporation, which I think is really cool, because nowadays we think of Muzak as being this kind of cheesy, innocuous, smooth jazz that you hear in elevators and supermarkets. But it had some pretty interesting origins in the pre and post-war years, the 1930s, 1940s. And Burris-Meyer was right at the center of it. He acted as a consultant to Muzak early on, and he later became the vice president of the company from 1943 to 1947, right when Muzak was starting to gain popularity worldwide and was being used in a variety of different settings. So as seen as this Muzak brochure from the 1940s, Muzak cites a study conducted at Stevens by Burris-Meyer and his research assistant, Richard Carbonell, that measured the influence of music on lateness, early departures, absences, and overall employee morale. So as you can see, they found the use of controlled music, as it was called, in factories and offices could cut down early departures by 66%, which was particularly appealing if you operated a factory or managed a workforce. And we also have quite a few of these original research reports conducted at Stevens here that are preserved here in the archives. So promising to increase concentration, lower blood pressure, heightening productivity, all through the use of sound. So you can kind of see that there's a direct thread from this type of sound research that Burris-Meyer was doing in the 1930s, but instead of using it as a tool for creative expression in the theater, it was kind of used as a way to optimize worker productivity in office spaces, in classrooms, all over the place. So it's pretty cool stuff. So, and if you're interested, I'll just end it with the slide here of how music actually worked. There were actual musicians who recorded music depending on the specifications that a client wanted in their workforce. So you ordered music for your office, you would get like a catalog of sounds categorized by feeling. So you can choose from peppy or happy or pensive or any other feeling, which would then be pressed to vinyl and played through amplifiers that were put into the workspace and controlled by like a central office. And last thing is we actually have one of the amplifiers used by music. So this was probably used in like the 1950s. It doesn't work, unfortunately. It's a tube amplifier. And so, you would have placed these like all throughout the factory, and there would be dials here that would be controlled by music employees. And what I particularly like about this is that there's a dial for music. So you could turn the music from 1 to 10, depending on how much music you wanted. And there's all these other different little settings here, but it would be kind of a cool project to get this thing up and running at some point, because it's a pretty remarkable little piece of history right here at Stevens. So that is the Stevens Music Connection. So I'll turn it over to Professor Swindall.
All right. Wow, that was really fascinating. So I'm going to speak a little bit about how historians use archives, and I want to kind of divide that into two categories. I'll talk a little bit about both teaching and research. And for the teaching side of things, Ted, can you go back to that slide with the letter from Andrew Carnegie for just a second, please? So one of the ways that I have been using archives in my teaching, so I teach surveys of US history, and those are really broad classes, right, where you cover like a very, large amount of time in a small amount of space. And I try to punctuate those lectures and discussions with history that's a little bit closer to home by talking a lot about like New York City and Hoboken and Stevens Institute itself. And the archives have really helped me to do that. I steal from their digital things and the 150th timeline all the time in my lectures. So thank you. And that's probably a good place to say that historians, we cannot do our jobs without archivists. I mean, I cannot, write the books that I've written and the articles that I've written and published without people like Leah and Ted. They are absolutely crucial to the work that we do. And I love the title to this event, Out of the Archives and Into the Future, because we can't bring any of these stories into the future without looking into the past and without understanding the archives. And we absolutely cannot do that. Historians are we're sort of like the vehicles from bringing the information out of the archive into like the public discourse, right? But most people, a lot of people don't even know about archivists and what they do. But we really depend on, these relationships with archivists and, the cataloging and the processing of collections. I mean, I can't just sit down and go through an unprocessed collection. I mean, that would take years and years and years. The work of a historian is already, very meticulous, but it's made much easier by the archivists who process the collections and get them into order and put them into a kind of shape that you can make sense of and go through systematically in order to begin to reveal and uncover the stories that are in the archives. And so we're all indebted, really, anyone who's a historian or a student of history are indebted to the archivist, and they don't get enough credit. So today we're giving credit to the archivists because we need you, we love you, we couldn't do our work without you. Yay. So So I wanted to return to the letter from Andrew Carnegie on the death of Dr. Morton. And Leah's presentation made me feel much prouder to have my office in the Morton building on campus, because I learned a lot about him just now. So one of the things that I do, for example, when I do a lecture on the Gilded Age in America, is talk about Andrew Carnegie's connection to Stevens Institute as a way of kind of bringing home the ideals of the Gilded Age. And so when we read, for example, like an excerpt from Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, where he talks about philanthropy and the importance of philanthropy and, giving money back to public institutions, I can bring that all the way home here to Stevens Institute and say, Carnegie had this relationship with Dr. Morton, and Carnegie gave money to Stevens Institute. And if you've ever been to Carnegie Laboratory on campus, that's because of Andrew Carnegie. And so his philanthropy, touched all of us who are here. And in that way, the history, I think, resonates a bit more closely, and kind of, I think it's really cool that we have letters like this signed by Andrew Carnegie in our archive. And, to me as a historian, to see something like that is just so exciting. Like my heart jumps to see Andrew Carnegie's signature. It's a wonderful piece in our collection. So in teaching, I also try to, bring in stories about the Stevens family from our collections here, or Hoboken, and just kind of punctuate what would be a broad, very broad, US history, and bring it home, bring it much closer to home with those little pieces of information that we have in the archives that really illuminate the history that is much closer to home. So Ted, if you could go back to the Paul Robeson slide. So I'm going to talk about my major archives crush, since Leah framed it that way. I'll steal her title. As a researcher, historians use archives basically to mine these stories from the past, and to, sort of figure out through all of this unpublished data, what are the important stories? What are the stories that really shape our times? Where can we really learn about ourselves and our culture, and use that as a key to, better understand where we're at today? These kinds of fundamental questions that really shape the historian's craft are all facilitated by archives themselves. When I was an undergraduate, I actually had some really exciting opportunities to work in archives. I got to study abroad as a history exchange student. I was at the University of South Carolina, and I studied at the University of Warwick in England as an exchange student. And I was really interested in connections between Africa and the United States and the West. And so I was studying Southern African history while I was there, and actually became friends with someone whose family was living in Botswana. And he invited me to spend our 4-week Easter break in Southern Africa. And so here I am on my junior year abroad, off to Africa. And when I told my history professor I was going to Africa, he was like, well, you need to write your research essay on Botswana. So I was like, oh my goodness, now I have to figure out how to write a research essay on Botswana while I'm in Botswana. And so for me, it was like trial by fire. Like no one had ever really shown me how to make this happen. And I was just kind of figuring things out as I went along. And I ended up at the University of Botswana in the Botswana history collection, where the archivist was very nice, and it seemed like nobody really used the archive. And so I think they were kind of really happy actually to have someone there who was interested in the history and using some of their documentation. So that was kind of like the first time I started to really work in primary sources. And I was totally hooked. It was like super, super fascinating to me. And that was really, for me, the moment when I knew I just wanted to be a historian, and that was what I wanted to do. And I found these really meaningful letters from some of the tribal chiefs in Botswana the colonial leaders of the British Empire, arguing for their independence. And it was so moving to see that. And when you see the original documents and hold the original documents in your hands, and I mean, there's nothing like it. It's like, I mean, it moves me just to think about it, which I don't know, I feel silly right now. But when you hold those documents and those artifacts in your hands, you're connecting to the history. And you feel that these people are connected to you. I mean, that's why you develop crushes on these people, like Leah was saying. Like, we are connected to these people. We know these people. We spend time with these people through their artifacts and through their documents. And, you know, when you get hooked on that, it's so exciting. And I mean, that's the fun part. The other side of it is hours and hours and hours of long, meticulous, tedious work. Right? There is, you know, that's the other side of working in an archive. You can sit in a collection and go through box after box, day after day, and not find answers to any of your questions sometimes. And Ted and Leah are both nodding. We've all totally been there. But then there are the moments when, you know, something happens and you find something really exciting, and that makes your article, or that brings home one of the ideas in like your dissertation or your book project. And like, I remember that happening when I was working on my dissertation, and it was about Paul Robeson's Othello. And I was trying to connect his political life with his performances of Othello. And I found this really obscure pamphlet with an article that had been written by someone who told the story of Paul Robeson having to actually go to an interview on a radio broadcast immediately from the stage at Schubert Theater in New York City. And he had to get there so quickly that he didn't have time to change out of his costume. So he was literally at this interview dressed as Othello. And I was like, oh my God, that totally makes the case of what I'm trying to say in my whole dissertation. Like, here he is giving a political interview dressed as Othello. And then like, that was one of those moments where you're just like, you know, hooray. And you never know where those things are going to crop up. It's funny too, because things will come up in collections where you never really expected it. And that kind of brings me to this collection here. So there's actually information about Paul Robeson here at Stevens in the Harold Burris-Meyer collection, which, like, who would have guessed? I would have never in a million years, if the archivists hadn't told me, known that there's this super cool connection at Stevens to Paul Robeson. So as I mentioned, Robeson is kind of like my major archives crush and the focus of my dissertation. And I wrote 2 books about him, and then a book about 2 organizations that he was involved in. And when I started here at Stevens, I remember getting an email from Leah. This was years ago, Leah, you probably don't remember. And she was like, you're into Paul Robeson. We have this stuff on Paul Robeson here at Stevens. And I was kind of like, what? I was like, you do? Because I never imagined that at a tech school, there would have been somebody like Burris-Meyer who was into drama and bringing together drama and sound. And so that was the first time that I went to check out the collection. And it ended up being really, really cool because of my context of knowing about Robeson. I could kind of put together what Burris-Meyer was trying to do, because I knew that Robeson for many years was interested in sound amplification in the theater. And he had experimented in a few concerts with some amplification. And this was something that reviewers detested. And they were like, you shouldn't do this. It ruins the sound of, you know, the vocalist. But Robeson usually performed as a solo vocalist with only a piano accompanist. And that's really hard on the voice. It's just you on the stage all the time. And he was also somebody who gave a lot of speeches as well. So he was looking for ways to kind of mitigate the stress on his voice. And so he makes this really interesting connection with Burris-Meyer, who's also interested in sound in the theater. And so that's what actually got Paul Robeson here to Stevens Institute. And that's what these images are. So there was an event in March of 1941, right here at Devon Auditorium. And not just Paul, but a number of luminaries from Broadway came. And there were a couple of nights of performances where they utilized Burris-Meyer's sound. And Ted, if you want to jump in here at all, feel free, because the sound part of things is not my expertise, but I can speak to the fact that Burris-Meyer had a really fascinating correspondence with people who were like the biggest playwrights and stars and critics on Broadway at that time. Like, he was writing to Eugene O'Neill, the playwright. He was writing to Brooks Atkinson, who was like the New York theater critic of the moment. He was in touch with Margaret Webster, who was a major director, who would actually work in 1942 and 43 with Robeson on their major production of Othello, which would debut on Broadway in the fall of 1943. And so when I started to dig into this collection, I was just like, whoa, this guy is in touch with, you know, like some serious celebrities, and like these people who are major in the arts world are coming to Stevens because they're interested in what he's doing. And so that was really fascinating to me, like this moment right before World War II, where these people are coming together, and they're coming over from New York City to Hoboken to perform and to demonstrate this sound amplification system. So Robeson was able to do this one performance, and they did a piece from The Emperor Jones, which was a famous play by Eugene O'Neill. It had been first performed by an actor by the name of Charles Gilpin, and then Robeson also performed on stage, and he was in the film version of The Emperor Jones. In one of the scenes that they did, if you've ever seen the film by chance, the drumming throughout the whole film is very integral to the plot and the sort of psychological changes in the emperor and how he evolves throughout the film. And so I immediately knew why Burris-Meyer would have wanted The Emperor Jones, because if you're working with sound amplification, then the drum beat and the changing of it and the sound it would bring to the theater for the audience to really experience the drumming and experience the kind of psychological torture that the emperor is undergoing. I could just see how powerful that must have been in the theater, and why it would have really drawn Paul to come to Hoboken to Stevens Institute to perform, you know? And so it was really fascinating to me. And I've now integrated some of that information into some of the public lectures that I do on Robeson, especially in Hoboken. I talked about it last Black History Month at the Hoboken Historical Museum, and everybody there was like really into the fact that Paul had been to Hoboken. And so it's a super connection to make, and it's meaningful for me on a personal level, because now when I'm in Devon Auditorium, or if I'm teaching at Edwin A. Stevens, I always think of the fact that, you know, Paul Robeson has been here, and I feel, you know, even more connected to the history, and, you know, connected to someone like Burris-Meyer, who was really interesting in his range of you know, intellectual pursuits, and really bringing the arts together with something like sound research and physics. You know, to me, that's such a beautiful marriage of the technology and, you know, the humanities and the arts, you know, all coming together. And in these events really, I think, portrayed that so well. So I think I think that's everything I want to say, but thanks so much for coming out to talk about the archives and to experience some of this, because this stuff is, I think, just so fascinating and informative.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. This has been so interesting. And now I would like to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pose them in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and then I will ask them of Dr. Swindall, Ted, and Leah. So at this time, if you have any questions, please feel free. I know.
Yeah,
go ahead. I have a question. No, I have a question that you may have already covered, actually, and I apologize if you did cover this. Do we have any recordings of Muzak? in the collection? No, no archives. Okay.
Easily accessible online though. There's stuff going back to like the 1940s. Like people have uploaded like entire records, like some of which were used in industrial settings. It's all online. But
Yeah.
no, it would be pretty cool if we had some recordings.
Yeah, that would be really neat to see that, to listen to that. All right, cool, great, thanks. We do have a question. This question is for Dr. Swindall. How did you come to study Robeson? Is there a Botswana connection?
Oh, so I might have misled you there. There's not one that I know of anyway. Although he was much beloved in Southern Africa for his recordings, and his organization, the Council on African Affairs, spoke out against apartheid for many years. But I really fell in love with Robeson actually through my Shakespeare class, and it was his performances of Shakespeare that really, first kind of, I guess, lured me in. And then as I learned more about him and his politics and his civil rights activism and how that fused with his artistic life, that was really what I guess first drew me to his performances of Othello, and then deeper into his life and his political organizations as well. And he's a native of New Jersey. I should have thrown that in. So he,
right. And in fact, I know that there's a number of buildings at Rutgers University that are named, correct? Right. Okay. Right.
Yeah, last year was the 100th anniversary of his graduation from Rutgers. So they did a number of events around that. And there's also his birthplace in Princeton as well, which was where he grew up.
Oh, that's great. That's very interesting. Wow. Leah, I have a question for you. The Morton building, and this is related to Dr. Morton, obviously, was that built while he was living, or was that built after he passed away?
He helped, he provided some of the funds for that building. He actually donated a lot of money to Stevens as well. He even bought, lab equipment and things that they needed on campus in general. But the Morton building was not completed until 1906. And so Morton had passed away already in 1902. And he passed away kind of suddenly. Like he got sick all of a sudden and passed away. It was very unexpected. It wasn't like a long illness or anything like that. So, but the only two buildings that were really on campus while he was president from 1870 to 1902 were EAS, which was the main building, and then the Carnegie Laboratory, which was completed and dedicated in 1902.
Wow, wow. And so Dr. Humphreys was the president at the time of Dr. Morton's death, right? Okay. And do we have a lot of photos in the archives of what campus looked like back in the day? Like back around that time? I'm curious to see, more photos and maps and stuff like that. Do we have stuff like that?
We do, and we just recently uploaded a campus building collection onto the digital portal collection that we have online. It's, I think we have the link up on the first slide maybe. So we've been adding to that when we can. We do have a lot of maps, like old campus maps and such, but we don't have them all digitized yet. In many cases, like some of the campus maps are actually in more unprocessed collections. So we would need to process them, make sure that we have arranged and described them. We create finding aids. That's our cataloging record, which we put online once we have a collection processed. And then we would digitize it if we're able to and put it online.
That's wonderful.
The campus buildings collection is like probably one of our more comprehensive collections. Like we have photos of what Stevens looked like when it first opened, like the first year that it was in operation, and what Hoboken looked like in the years before because of the Stevens family collection. But it's not only like buildings in construction and what the campus looked like, but there's a lot of like, and we posted about some of this stuff online, but there's a lot of like proposed plans for redeveloping Stevens that were actually never, completed. So you get to see these kind of like alternate versions of what Stevens would have looked like had the funding been available, or had they, decided to go ahead with this plans. And a lot of that's been put on the campus buildings collection in the link here, but we post about that stuff a lot on the Instagram at stevensarchives.com. So if you want to see an alternate future Stevens, go take a look.
That's exciting. So that's great. So for our friends who are on the call today, they can look at our Instagram. They can also go to the digital collections portal. And if they have any questions, they can always reach out to you and also to their professor. So are there any other questions at this time? Okay, we have one question here. Mr. Houghtaling, could you talk more about the work that Harold Burris-Meyer was doing with regards to light and sound?
Yeah, Professor Swindall kind of touched on a little bit of it, like as just like one example, the drumming sound during like that second sound show in 1941. I mean, it wasn't just the sound of drums played on a big amplifier system. There was a whole staff of researchers at Stevens who developed this whole sound system, which I think I briefly mentioned. And some of it were like sub-reverberant sounds along with speakers that were devoted to higher frequency sounds. So when you have about like 18 or 20 speakers installed in a space and some of them are playing these like sub-bass frequencies, I mean, the descriptions that I read and some of the reviews of the show said that the entire Debon auditorium was shaking, like the whole walls. It was like this intense, like almost mind-altering thing that he was kind of experimenting with. And it kind of goes along with a lot of the other experimentation being done during that day by like a lot of like avant-garde composers like Edgar Varese or like Stockhausen or Zignexis and guys like that. So I mean, there's like this continuum of research that was being done at Stevens in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and a lot of it was sponsored research. But a lot of it was Burris-Meyer, as Professor Swindall said. He's borrowing from what's going on across the river and around the country and around the world, and taking a lot of these ideas that only existed in the arts and synthesizing them and kind of providing like the technical knowledge needed to implement them in these like pretty interesting experiments. But I mean, that's just one example. I mean, like the collection has technical diagrams. It has a lot of research reports that he had to deliver to the Rockefeller Foundation, who were providing the funds. So if you want to know more about like specific projects, it's all in that collection. So just email us, thoughta@stevens.edu, and we can provide some more stuff for you.
That's great. Excellent, excellent. So any more questions that we might have today? All right, so if you think of something in the future, please do not hesitate to reach out to our presenters today. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we close for the day? We're all set?
Just thank you for coming. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming, and thanks for hosting, Linda.
Oh, it's my pleasure, as always. Thank you. I'm always excited about the work all of you are doing, and just having a conversation with you is so very exciting. I always learn something new. So thank you so much.
Great to see you, Olivia.
I know. Hi,
Olivia.
I miss you too.
We miss you too. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.